Hello, I'm Bridget Goodwin from Australia. I'm the president of the Australian Apitherapy Association. Thank you so much to Professor Rosenberg for the invitation to speak at your wonderful conference. I'm going to talk to you today about the poisonous plants of Australia and the challenges and triumphs. New European immigrants to Australia a few hundred years ago were definitely in a strange foreign land. Australia is a large island with many diverse climates and ecosystems, and to the foreigners, thousands of mystifying plants, many of which were poisonous. White Europeans travelled to Australia as explorers and later settled either as free settlers or as convicts. The centuries-old knowledge of European botany and traditional medicine no longer applied, and if they assumed it did, there were often deadly results. I'm here today to tell you a few fascinating stories about some of those discoveries, and while you might imagine it's all gruesome, there are some good outcomes as well, as the foreigners persevered with investigating the medicinal potential of some of these menacing plants. It wasn't for some time that the European settlers to this foreign land worked out that the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal people, had a very sophisticated understanding of their native botany. And this was commented on by Professor John Pern, the historian, in 1987, when he said, of course, the Aboriginal pharmacopoeia had been highly developed millennia before the first fleet. The country's original inhabitants were superb botanists, sophisticated pharmacognosists of the indigenous flora, and were well aware of and exploited the phenomenon of the pharmacological variation among different races of the same species of plant. But until the European settlers had some more experience, there were some quite shocking incidents. European exploring parties in Australia from the 17th to the 19th centuries suffered poisoning several times by eating, for example, unprocessed cycad seeds. They reported violent vomiting and diarrhea from these encounters. Some were misled into thinking that those seeds were a safe food because they'd seen the local Aboriginal people collecting them and eating them. Dutch members of de Vlaming's 1697 expedition at the Swan River, or present-day Perth in Western Australia, members of James Cook's 1770 expedition at the Endeavour River in North Queensland, French sailors of the La Perouse expedition at Botany Bay in 1788, members of Matthew Flinders' expedition in 1801 in present-day Western Australia, and members of Sir George Grey's expedition in Western Australia in 1839, all encountered the same problem where some of their party were poisoned by eating these cycad seeds. Another famous example of this kind of misadventure was in relation to the early European explorers in Australia, Burke and Wills, who famously died in the desert. There is a theory that they had tried to eat a flower made from the nardoo plant because they'd seen local Aborigines eating this. During the expedition in 1861, Burke and Wills observed Aboriginal people grind Marsilliae sporocarps, the fern's reproductive structures, between stones to produce a gritty yellowish flower. Unfortunately, they didn't do what their Aboriginal helpers had done, and those people had routinely washed the raw material and processed it before cooking it. So there's a theory that this might have contributed to the demise of these famous explorers, Burke and Wills. Aboriginal people had known and practiced the art of detoxifying native plants since the Pleistocene era. For example, the seeds of cycad plants, the toxic seeds that I was referring to earlier, produce acute symptoms if untreated, including the poison psychocin. 3 traditional methods were used to treat these seeds by the Indigenous people, and they included briefly leaching in water, prolonged leaching in water, and aging to prepare them to be eaten. There were many examples of poisoning or near poisoning, and this is one from the New South Wales Medical Gazette of October 1871, where a little girl was accidentally poisoned when her father had given her some cycad nuts to play with as knuckle bows. The early German explorer Ludwig Leichhardt wrote many observations of how the indigenous people managed these, to him, strange new plants for food. During his travels in 1847, Leichhardt worked out that detoxification of certain seeds and nuts was necessary for their use as food. Leichhardt described how the natives at this season seemed to live principally off Pandanus spiralis and cycads, and he noted that they both evidently required much preparation to be prepared to destroy the poisonous properties before they could be used as food. Without this indigenous knowledge, humans were susceptible to poisoning from eating cycad seeds. Aboriginal people had used them for a source of carbohydrates, but only after extensive preparation. The food value of cycad seeds is exceptionally high, at about 43% carbohydrate and 5% protein, and the plants yielded more food per hectare than many European cultivated crops. Aboriginal people increased the size of the cycad populations by their burning practices. Regularly burning increased the seed production by 7 or 8 times and synchronized their fruiting to support large gatherings of people at ceremonial occasions through their harvest. The collection and processing of each kilogram of cycad seeds by the Anbara people of Arnhem Land provided food with an energy content of 1,300 calories. This could be done in an hour so that one woman could feed herself adequately on 2 hours of work per day. A common activity making use of the poisonous elements of Australian native plants was to use them as fish poison or piscicides as an aid to catching fish, where they would immerse certain plants in pools of water or billabongs to stupefy the fish and make them easier to catch. Another example of the fish poison trees is Barrington Asiatica, known as beach Barrington or fish poison tree, one of the most impressive of the native coastal vegetation with stunning filamentous blossoms. The fish poison tree is usually occurring in mangrove habitats from islands of the Indian Ocean to the west to tropical Asia and islands of the Western Pacific Ocean. This is another example of one of the fish poison trees in the family Myrtaceae. It's the Tephrosia rosea or Flinders River poison tree. A lot of the Europeans were fascinated by how the native indigenous people used these trees for fish poison to help catch fish. And some people commented, like Joseph Maiden in 1895, that the Aboriginal people had known for a very long time how to use these plants for their advantage. However, other European settlers to Australia who didn't understand it developed superstition and even commented on magic and regarded the use of fish poison to catch fish from the native vegetation as sorcery. Otherwise, humans trying out the seeds as a food source, such as by troops during military exercises, has caused poisoning. The size and abundance of the seeds can be very tempting to the hungry and uninformed. Roasting alone does not abolish the toxicity of the seeds. Aboriginal people traditionally used the seeds as a source of food, but they applied various methods to remove toxins first. One such method was to grate or pound them first, then to place them in woven baskets in running fresh water for several days before drying and cooking. Various attempts by non-Indigenous Australians at producing a harmless edible product from the seeds by similar methods resulted in disastrous consequences. The story of native plants wasn't always just about poison. Often medicinal value was identified for plants like the black bean, although its toxic properties historically overwhelmed this. The inner white bark had a particular potent poison that appealed to the vindictive side of some people. In 1969, a writer called Len Webb noted its use boiled in water to make a poisonous solution, which was allegedly put in the victim's food or drink. Modern tests have isolated a number of water-soluble alkaloids, which showed antiviral, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory, and possible pesticidal activity. Although these compounds are highly toxic, they've played an important role in biochemical investigations into viral disorders such as HIV/AIDS. The bark of the tree was traditionally used as an antibacterial remedy for the treatment of skin problems and a natural bandage for wrapping burns. Another mystifying plant that took a while for European visitors, invaders, new settlers to Australia was the native bloodroot plant, Hemadorum laxum. And Ludwig Leichhardt described in 1848 how he watched large crops of this plant being eaten by cockatoos, much to his amazement, because he said the plant was as pungent as chilies, and it certainly took some management when it came to learning how to use this type of spice in cooking. There were other techniques that the Europeans observed the Indigenous people when it came to processing foods or the plants that they found so mystifying. The Noongar of southwestern Australia were unique because they actually processed the red fruit Sarcotesta of the Macrozamia by using it in an anaerobic fermentation. And it's thought that this was used because of the very low water in the environment. So this was quite a fascinating process that was used, and they observed that Aboriginal people in other parts of Australia had a different way of fermenting this particular plant, and it actually, their specialised scientific understanding about this fermentation meant that they were able to extract valuable sources of high energy fat and nutrition and vitamin A from this process. An interesting observation is that many Australian native animals, of course, were adapted to manage the poisons of the plants. An example is the Australian cassowary bird, which is a rainforest bird. It had the ability to eat toxic seeds, and they would be able to pass through unharmed and essentially be buried in a pile of poo fertiliser in the forest to help distribute the trees, but the birds themselves are unaffected by the toxic content of the seeds. Another interesting plant that also was poisonous and mystifying to the European new settlers in Australia was the white chinaberry tree or white cedar, which was actually linked to the mahogany species in other countries. Its wide dispersal means that it has various names: umbrella cedar, pride of India, Indian lilac, Persian lilac, and chinaberry. The name Melia was the Greek name given to the ash tree because of its meaning, which means poison tree, as parts of it are toxic. The coolabah tree was quite well known as a fish poison tree, but like many eucalyptus, it also was capable of producing an oil that, if you didn't know what you were doing, could also be toxic. But as I'm sure many people know now, because it's quite famous, the citronellol or eucalyptus oil from many eucalyptus trees is now regarded as being quite helpful, medicinal, containing many useful terpenes, including eucamol, limonene, linalool, terpenine, terpineol, and various others. And it's a highly prized medicinal oil, but like many essential oils, if it's consumed in large quantities or even small quantities, it can itself be quite toxic. This is Eucalyptus citriodora, again, another source of eucalyptus oil, and studies have shown that it's very useful for arthritis, for edema, inflammation, and many other health issues. The Entada fasciolides, or matchbox bean, is another plant that caused a lot of confusion and some misunderstandings, but better understanding of native vegetation has led to some interesting medicine. So this plant is an evergreen woody climber, and it produces these large seeds, but what's become better known now is that it's commonly cultivated for the saponin in many parts of Asia, and was actually used as a kind of soap. So despite the toxicity, this plant and its seeds can be rendered edible by prolonged soaking and roasting, and it's even been used as a coffee substitute. The matchbox bean was also recommended for gynecological problems by the indigenous people, and it was deployed as a contraceptive in combination with Dioscorea bulbifera, or aerial yam. Of course, it was important to know where the food and the medicine was. The succulent leaf bases and the central growth shoots of grass trees, shown here in this picture, provided edible greens. In Tasmania, the bases of the inner grass tree leaves were roasted before they were eaten. In species that do not form a large trunk, such as the small grass tree or Xanthorrhoea minor, the lower portion of the leaves at their underground junction with the root were drawn out and eaten, the flavour resembling that of a nut. Not all parts of the grass tree are edible, the green flowering stalks of most species and the resin of some being poisonous. The river red gum is another interesting one. It actually occurs along riverbanks and has the capacity to pump water from its very deep roots. And it was used quite a lot medicinally. Its leaves were burnt and the ash was used as a kind of medicine. And the wood, which is actually bright red when it's cut, can ward off some pests. And it was also, it seems, used as a natural antibiotic. Few Australian species of the Solanaceae family have recorded medicinal uses. The roots of the flannel bush, Solanium laciophilum, were boiled and applied as a poultice to leg swellings. The process of ripening usually metabolizes the toxic alkaloids into saponins with greatly reduced toxicity. Even so, there are a few native species that retain toxins in the ripe berries. They include Solanum quadrilocutum, Solanium petrophyllum, the potato bush or wild tomato, the devil's fig, the Indian nightshade, or the devil's apple. The devil's apple is one of those Australian native poisonous plants that actually has a good news story, because in recent years it's been realised that it's actually very effective at treating basal cell carcinoma or skin cancer. And there are commercial preparations based on this originally regarded as poisonous plant. Studies into the effectiveness of the devil's apple as a skin cancer cure are shown here, and quite a few common folk stories and news reports have occurred quoting local people in Queensland making up skin cancer cures from this effectively weed growing wild in the bush, and it has become quite a famous story now. A particularly unpleasant toxin, unsurprisingly, the milky mangrove was employed as a deliberate poison in many places throughout its range from Asia to the Pacific Islands. In Australia, Aboriginal people at Port Curtis near Rockhampton, Queensland, used it as a poison for their spears, while in Papua New Guinea, it was used as a piscicide or fish poison and as an arrow poison. The Cunjuvoi or Alocasia macariza, while not considered a first-rate choice, could be made fit for the table. However, the detoxification strategies were quite laborious. It could take a lot of processing and time before the result was deemed edible. Even so, some plants would only ever yield foodstuffs considered to be a form of famine food, merely fit for desperate times. Early Australian medical practitioners quickly became familiar with its hazardous nature. Dr. John Macpherson issued a warning in the Medical Journal of Australia in 1929, when fresh from the corm is considered to be a deadly poison. The stout stem also contains this acrid principle. The leaves and petiole are likewise full of the burning juice, which will blister the lips if applied to them. Taken internally by man or beast, it causes great pain and swelling in the throat and tongue, and is an intense gastric irritant. F.M. Bailey mentioned the culinary and medicinal use of Cangivoy in the Journal of the Royal Society of Queensland in 1884. Colocasia macariza, this plant is the pichu of the Burnett Aboriginals. The rhizome, partially dried and roasted in the ashes, are eaten by them as food. The leaves are frequently used, with good effect, by European settlers as a vesicatory in case of acute rheumatism. The northern Queensland root was treated similarly. This is the ordinary method of preparation in the Cooktown area. There are diverse medicinal reports that mention the therapeutic use of Cangivoy. Ron Hamlin Harris and Frank Smith noted in 1916, "It must be regarded as of great general utility by the Aborigine, for Roth and others mention that its rootstock is eaten after preparation, and modern blacks regard the roots crushed and heated as a useful application in syphilis." Early settlers in Australia applied the leaf juice to relieve sunburn, taking great care not to get any in the eye, and the stems were useful for ulcerated sores. The leaf poultice was reputed to be effective for pain relief, such as that associated with arthritis. Taro and Cangivoy leaves have been traditionally used in the treatment of cancer. In traditional Chinese medicine, Colocasia esculenta has a reputation for softening the hard, which has led to its use in the forms of treating growths and masses. This quite attractive looking plant is the Exocaria aligaca, but otherwise commonly known as the blind your eye mangrove, because it became commonly known that the sap of this tree, if it got into your eyes, would cause temporary blindness. The plant grows in saline and brackish water in tropical mangrove forests, and it's distributed in India, Bangladesh, and in Australia. Within Australia, it thrives from northern New South Wales along the northern coastline around to Western Australia. It has wood and leaf extracts containing diterpenoids that, as it turns out, have anti-tumour properties. Indeed, compounds with anti-cancer potential have been found inside this plant. The Hippomane manchinella from the family Euphorbiaceae is commonly called death apples, or also blind your eye mangrove. In 1678, the author of Buccaneers of America described it thus: "One day, being hugely tormented with mosquitoes or gnats, and as yet unacquainted with the nature of this tree, I cut a branch thereof to serve me instead of a fan, but all my face swelled the next day and filled with blisters as if it were burnt, to such a degree that I was blind for 3 days." Surprisingly, drug research has taken a serious interest in the milky mangrove. Investigations have supported its potential as an antiviral, anti-HIV, antibacterial, and anti-cancer agent. Extracts from the leaf and stem have shown anti-HIV activity, with leaf extracts possessing substantial antioxidant effect that was attributed to the ellagic acid. The bark and roots of the Myrtaceae family were traditionally brewed with water, and solution is applied to treat infected skin, lesions, scabies, burns, and wounds. Steam was inhaled to relieve congestion of the nasal and bronchial passages. They've been more recently studied for the inhibition of malignant melanoma and colon carcinoma. So as an island continent, it becomes fairly clear that with the many extreme climates and different circumstances that plants have had to survive in, that they've developed quite interesting secondary metabolites that seem to have very promising medicinal qualities. So there's been recent research just on the fruits of rainforest, and this particular chart shows some tropical fruits that have shown particular benefit in the treatment of, for example, pancreatic cancer. Most fruits are generally consumed for their nutritional value. However, they also have been used for their enhancing health properties. For example, the common guava has been used as food, but it's been traditionally used in other parts of the world to treat inflammation, diabetes, hypertension, dental caries, wounds, pain relief, and reducing fever. The secondary metabolites in mangroves have been found to be useful against cancer cells. The search for bioactive compounds from coastal mangroves in the pharmacological area is still largely unresearched, even though many researchers have proven that mangroves can be a good source of natural drugs. From the secondary metabolites, antioxidants can be found and used as a drug. The antioxidants are also useful in maintaining the homeostasis of the immune system. Mangroves have been reported to generate steroid, alkaloids, and terpenoids, which have biological benefits such as anti-diabetic, anti-cancer, and antioxidant abilities. The antioxidant properties of some of these rainforest fruits have been shown to be because of their high camphorol, quercetin, and myrcetin content. The flavonols are ubiquitous in these rainforest fruits, and this has led to a great deal of interest in researching them as anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory properties. One of these fruits from the Alpinia Catsumeidae families in Jurabaceae, from the ginger family, alpinetin is one of the main constituents of the seeds. It's found to possess strong anti-cancer effects and able to induce apoptosis of pancreatic cancer cells. So this is causing quite a bit of interest for researchers. In general, flavonones have shown a positive association with anti-pancreatic cancer activity. However, most studies have been limited to being performed at the in vitro level. Despite the disturbing discovery of poisonous plants in Australia, it's gratifying to find that recent research has identified a number of our native fruits, particularly the rainforest fruits, as having great potential as anti-cancer medicines. The potential of novel anti-cancer phytochemicals from Australian native fruits has been growing with recent research. Furthermore, Aborigines have gained experience and knowledge over thousands of years on the cultivation of these Australian floras and their medicinal benefits. Numerous Indigenous floras have been used as traditional medicine to treat various ailments such as cold, flu, fever, toothache, internal pain, asthma, and chronic internal illness. However, in the context of cancer, few plants have been traditionally used. Kakadu plum, kunzea, and the Illawarra plum are just some of the native fruits that are being researched for their medicinal qualities. One of the plants that's attracted quite a bit of attention for its reputed medicinal properties is Scaevola spinescens, or the marone bush, currant bush, or fan flower. It's a rigid, scrubby bush about 1 metre tall, and Aboriginal people used to drink a decoction of the root for stomach ache and urinary problems. An infusion of the roots was drunk for pains of the alimentary tract, and a decoction of broken up steam was used to cure boil, sore, and rashes. The whole plant was burned and the fumes inhaled for colds. It's interesting to note that an extract of this plant has been prepared and supplied to cancer sufferers from the Chemistry Centre of WA since 1957. Petala stigma pubescens extracts have been shown to have promising therapeutic agents in the treatment of hyperglycemia and hypertension, commonly known as the quinine bush. It's an Australian Euphorbiaceae genus which consists of 7 species. It's shown to have promising antibacterial, antifungal and antiviral components. Australian Aborigines traditionally use this plant as an antiseptic to treat sore eyes. The fruit were also held in the mouth to relieve toothache. Recent studies have confirmed the antibacterial, antifungal and antiviral activity of extracts from this plant. The Eremophila species are locally dominant in many areas, often growing in impoverished sites. In general, they are tolerant of harsh conditions, including drought, fire, frost, flooding, and grazing, the name poverty bush being aptly applied. In addition to this name, they are also known as the emu bush, fuchsia bush, tar, or turpentine bush. Geographic isolation has resulted in Australia having a unique and distinct flora. Many Australian plant species have developed specific survival strategies that allow them to inhabit the harsh, arid environment found in many parts of Australia. Indigenous Aboriginal people have used a number of these plant species with distinct curative properties for their well-being. Among over 70 plant species that have been used for medicinal purposes by Aboriginal people living in arid areas, the species of Eremophila is considered one of the most important. A number of the Eremophila species are highly valued for their medicinal ingredients, and it's very highly valued for its internal and external use. In more recent years, small-scale businesses have sprung up in Aboriginal communities, promising an economic development based on this plant. Scientists have identified 3 compounds with antibacterial activity against staphylococci from this species. The active compounds belong to 2 different classes, cerulutane diterpenoids and flavonoids. This provides an interesting comparison with the active compounds sourced from other Eremophila species. That concludes my presentation about the poisonous plants of Australia, challenges and triumphs. I hope you'll agree that despite the very disturbing stories of poisonings and misadventure, some very interesting research is ahead to discover the medicinal benefits of many of these as yet understudied Australian plants. Thank you so much.